The air was thick with the weight of decisions that could alter a lifetime. Mateus sat on the rickety wooden bench outside the modest bakery where his mother worked tirelessly to keep their family afloat. His hands trembled as he stared at the crumpled business card in his palm, a stark contrast to the simplicity surrounding him. The name embossed in gold letters gleamed in the fading sunlight. Eduardo Duarte, a name synonymous with power, money, and an empire of unimaginable wealth. Mateus's chest tightened. The offer was absurdly generous, a chance to step into a world he had only seen in magazines. But accepting it meant leaving behind everything he loved, including Clara, her laughter, her resilience, the way she saw beauty in the smallest things. It was all at stake. Yet the harsh reality of their finances gnawed at him relentlessly. Dreams could wait, bills could not. Clara appeared beside him, her presence soothing, yet charged with unspoken tension. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Mateus hesitated. How could he explain the weight of this decision? He looked at her, trying to memorize every detail, the curve of her smile, the way her hair caught the golden rays of the setting sun. "I have an opportunity," he began, his voice breaking under the strain of his inner conflict. "It could change everything for us, for my family." She tilted her head, searching his face for answers. "And for us?" The question lingered, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence between them grew oppressive, each second a reminder of what was slipping away. Mateus looked down, unable to meet her gaze. He thought of the debts piling up, his mother's exhaustion, and the way poverty had become a constant shadow over their lives. The card in his hand felt like salvation and betrayal all at once. "I don't know," he finally admitted, the words cutting through the stillness. Clara didn't press further. She simply reached for his hand, her touch warm yet trembling. The silence said more than any words could. The weight of their love was heavy, but the pull of financial stability was undeniable. Mateus stood, the bench creaking beneath him, and pocketed the card as if sealing his fate. The next morning, the city roared to life as Mateus stood outside a sleek office building downtown, a far cry from the world he knew. The air smelled of ambition and opportunity, tinged with the faint aroma of espresso from a nearby cafe. Inside, Eduardo Duarte sat behind a sprawling desk, his presence commanding. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You'll work hard, harder than you've ever worked in your life," Eduardo said, his sharp gaze dissecting Mateus's resolve. "But you'll be rewarded. I see potential in you. Don't waste it." Mateus nodded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I won't disappoint you." The deal was made, and the weight of it settled on Mateus's shoulders as he left the office. As he walked through the bustling streets, flashes of Clara's face haunted him. But he had chosen money, the promise of a better future, and the elusive sense of security it could provide. That evening, Mateus found himself staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror of his rented room. His face looked the same, but he felt unrecognizable. The boy who once dreamed of happiness now clung to a vision of financial freedom that felt as empty as the sterile walls around him. And yet, beneath the surface, doubt began to fester. Had he made the right choice? The thought lingered, its edges sharp and relentless. If you're feeling as torn as Mateus about the choices we make in life, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if faced with a decision like his? I'd love to hear your perspective. The first few weeks under Eduardo Duarte's command were a whirlwind of sharp suits, high-stakes meetings, and relentless demands. Mateus quickly realized that this world was not built for hesitation. Decisions were made in seconds, and hesitation was synonymous with weakness. His days began before sunrise and stretched far into the night, filled with numbers, negotiations, and the unyielding pursuit of profit. Yet despite his growing expertise, the emptiness gnawed at him, a reminder of the life he had left behind. Eduardo was a master of manipulation, his presence commanding every room he entered. To Mateus, he was both a mentor and a warning. The man's charisma masked a ruthlessness that was evident in the way he spoke of others. Employees were assets, competitors were obstacles, and money was the only constant. Mateus watched in silent awe as Eduardo turned conversations into transactions and relationships into leverage. He wanted to learn, but part of him recoiled at the cold efficiency of it all. One evening, Eduardo invited Mateus to a lavish gala at a towering skyscraper overlooking the city. The room sparkled with opulence, crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and an ocean of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Mateus stood at the edge of the room, a glass of champagne in hand, feeling both exhilarated and out of place. The crowd was a mixture of the elite, business magnates, celebrities, and political figures, all speaking a language of wealth that was still foreign to him. "Take it all in," Eduardo said, appearing beside him. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "This is what success looks like. These are the people who control everything, the ones who understand that money isn't just a tool, it's power." Mateus nodded, trying to absorb the lesson, but his gaze drifted toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below, a reminder of the world he had left behind. Clara's face flickered in his mind, unbidden and unwelcome, and he swallowed hard against the rising tide of regret. As the night wore on, Mateus met people who fascinated and repelled him in equal measure. There was a woman whose empire spanned continents, a man who controlled the city's real estate market, and a tech mogul whose latest invention promised to revolutionize global communication. They spoke in terms of billions, throwing around figures as casually as someone might discuss the weather. Mateus listened, smiled, and nodded, but the gap between their world and his own seemed insurmountable. By the time he returned to his small apartment that night, the exhilaration had worn off, leaving only fatigue and a sense of hollowness. He sat at the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, and wondered if this was what success felt like. His bank account was growing, and the demands of his family's finances were beginning to ease, but the cost felt higher than he had anticipated. Weeks turned into months, and Mateus became adept at navigating the world Eduardo had introduced him to. He learned how to speak the language of deals, how to read the subtleties of a negotiation, and how to present himself as someone who belonged. Yet, no matter how much he achieved, there was always a sense of distance, a gap between the man he had become and the boy he once was. One late afternoon, Mateus overheard a conversation that would change everything. He had returned to Eduardo's office to retrieve a forgotten folder when he heard raised voices behind the closed door. Curiosity got the better of him, and he lingered, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "We can't let this get out," Eduardo's voice was sharp, tinged with urgency. "If anyone finds out, it'll destroy everything we've built." Mateus froze. The tone was unlike anything he had heard from Eduardo before, fearful, almost desperate. He strained to hear more, but the voices dropped to a whisper and the conversation ended abruptly. When Eduardo emerged moments later, his expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his movements that hadn't been there before. Mateus returned to his desk, his mind racing. What secret was Eduardo hiding? And why did it feel like the answers would pull him even deeper into a world he was beginning to question? Mateus woke to the shrill sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand, pulling him out of a restless sleep. The screen illuminated with a message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. Not everything is as it seems." His heart skipped, a jolt of unease rushing through him. The words lingered in his mind, cryptic and unsettling. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling followed him like a shadow. The day unfolded as usual, filled with back-to-back meetings and the relentless hum of ambition. Eduardo's office was a whirlwind of activity, and Mateus moved through it with practiced precision. Yet, the message gnawed at him, its implications weaving into every interaction. Was it a warning, a threat, and, more importantly, who had sent it? That evening, Eduardo called for an impromptu meeting at a private club, an exclusive enclave of the city's elite. The interior was decadent. Dark mahogany walls, soft leather armchairs, and the faint aroma of cigars. As Mateus followed Eduardo inside, he felt the weight of eyes on him, the silent judgment of those who had long claimed this space as their own. The meeting was with a small group of investors, each one a towering figure in their respective industries. Eduardo led the discussion with his usual confidence, his voice smooth and commanding. Mateus watched, absorbing every word, but his mind wandered to the warning he had received. As the conversation turned to a potential deal, Eduardo glanced at Mateus, his expression expectant. "Mateus, your insight here is invaluable. What do you think?" The question caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly, masking his unease with a measured response. The investors nodded in approval, and Eduardo gave him a slight smile, a rare acknowledgement of his growing competence. But beneath the surface, Mateus felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. After the meeting, Eduardo lingered behind with one of the investors while Mateus stepped out into the crisp night air. The quiet was a stark contrast to the intensity inside, and he welcomed the reprieve. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through old photos as if seeking an anchor. Images of Clara stared back at him, her smile bittersweet. They hadn't spoken since he took the job, and he couldn't help but wonder if she ever thought about him. The silence was interrupted by a soft voice. Lost in thought. Mateus turned to see a woman leaning against the building, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was striking, her presence both disarming and enigmatic. "I guess you could say that," he replied, his tone cautious. She smiled faintly, stepping closer. "This world has a way of consuming people, doesn't it? One moment you think you're in control, and the next you're wondering if you even know who you are." Mateus studied her, intrigued. "You seem familiar with it." She tilted her head, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. "I've seen people lose themselves in the pursuit of money. It's easy to forget what really matters." Her words struck a chord, and for a moment he felt as though she could see straight through him. Before he could respond, she extended a hand. "Júlia." He shook her hand, her grip firm yet warm. "Mateus." "Be careful, Mateus," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Not everyone in this world has your best interests at heart." With that, she turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Mateus with more questions than answers. Who was she? And why did her warning feel so personal? Back at his apartment, Mateus replayed the evening in his mind. Eduardo's cryptic conversation, the unknown message, and Júlia's enigmatic presence formed a puzzle he couldn't yet piece together. He paced the small space, the unease growing into something darker, a suspicion that he was on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. As the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Mateus sat by the window, staring out at the distant skyline. Somewhere out there was the life he had chosen, the life he had left behind, and the truth waiting to unravel. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to shift, the ground beneath him unsteady and full of secrets. The rhythmic clatter of heels echoed through the pristine marble lobby as Mateus hurried to meet Eduardo in his office. Despite the polished exterior of the building and its occupants, an undercurrent of tension buzzed beneath the surface. Mateus felt it in the stares, the clipped tones of whispered conversations, and the unshakable sense that he was being watched. When he reached Eduardo's office, the door was ajar. He paused, catching fragments of a hushed conversation between Eduardo and an unfamiliar voice. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, guarded. Mateus hesitated, the memory of the mysterious warning text flashing in his mind. He knocked lightly, pushing the door open just enough to announce his presence. Eduardo turned, his smile quick and forced. "Ah, Mateus, come in." The other man, tall and sharply dressed, gave Mateus a once-over before excusing himself with a curt nod. As he exited, his cologne lingered, heavy and intrusive, much like his gaze. "Busy morning?" Mateus asked, trying to mask his unease. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Always. But it's the price we pay for staying on top. Speaking of which, there's someone I'd like you to meet." Mateus stiffened. Another meeting, another player in Eduardo's intricate game. But nothing could have prepared him for the face that greeted him when they entered the conference room. Júlia. She was seated at the far end of the table, a leather-bound notebook in front of her, and an air of quiet confidence enveloping her. She looked up, her expression unreadable but her gaze sharp. If she was surprised to see him, she didn't show it. "Mateus, this is Júlia," Eduardo began, gesturing between them. "She'll be assisting us with some sensitive projects. I believe you two might already know each other." Mateus faltered, the memory of their brief encounter replaying in his mind. "We've crossed paths," he said carefully, watching her for a reaction. Júlia gave a small nod, her smile enigmatic. "It's good to see you again." Eduardo seemed oblivious to the tension. "Excellent. Júlia brings a unique skill set that will be invaluable to us. I trust you'll work well together." The meeting that followed was a blur of technical jargon and veiled implications. Júlia contributed sparingly, her words precise and calculated, while Mateus found himself distracted by her presence. She was a puzzle, and he was certain her sudden appearance in Eduardo's orbit was no coincidence. After the meeting, Júlia lingered, her gaze lingering on Mateus as the others filtered out of the room. When they were alone, she crossed her arms and leaned against the table. "Small world, isn't it?" "Too small," Mateus replied, his tone cautious. "What are you doing here?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "The same thing as you, I imagine, trying to survive." Her words hung in the air, weighted with unspoken truths. Before Mateus could press her further, Eduardo's assistant appeared, summoning him to another meeting. Júlia slipped away, leaving Mateus with a sense of unease that refused to dissipate. That evening, Mateus sat in his apartment, replaying every moment of the day. The pieces didn't fit: Eduardo's guarded behavior, Júlia's sudden involvement, and the cryptic warning he had received. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he realized. As he stared out the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars, his phone buzzed, another message from the unknown number. Trust her, but not too much. Mateus's pulse quickened. The message was as maddeningly vague as the first, but it solidified one thing: he was being watched, and whoever was behind it knew more about his life than he was comfortable admitting. The night stretched on, and sleep eluded him. Questions swirled in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Who was Júlia really? What was Eduardo hiding? And how much longer could Mateus navigate this world of wealth and deception without losing himself completely? The air in Eduardo's office was tense, the kind of tension that tightened every breath and made silence feel like a threat. Mateus sat across from Eduardo, his palms pressed against his thighs, struggling to maintain his composure. Eduardo's gaze was sharp, his usual charm replaced by something colder, more calculating. "I need you to step up," Eduardo said, his voice low but commanding. "This deal could make or break us. I've put a lot of trust in you, Mateus. Don't disappoint me." Mateus nodded, his throat dry. He had been tasked with leading a high-stakes negotiation, one that would solidify Eduardo's dominance in a sector of the market already fraught with competition. It was an opportunity, but also a test, one that felt as much about loyalty as it did about competence. The meeting later that afternoon was held in a private suite, high above the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline. Mateus arrived early, his briefcase in hand, the weight of its contents mirrored by the weight in his chest. The opposing party was already seated, 3 men with stiff postures and unreadable expressions. As the conversation began, Mateus found his footing, drawing on the skills he had honed under Eduardo's guidance. The language of money and power came easier now, and he wielded it with precision. But as the hours ticked by, an undercurrent of doubt crept in. The terms Eduardo had insisted on were ruthless, bordering on unethical, and Mateus could feel the unease of his counterparts growing. Midway through the negotiation, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it, focusing on the deal, but the distraction lingered. When the meeting finally concluded with a tentative agreement in place, he stepped into the hallway and checked the message. "They'll turn on you if it suits them. Watch your back." The anonymous warnings were becoming more frequent, each one more unnerving than the last. Mateus scanned the corridor, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but it was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant pressure at the edges of his consciousness. Later that evening, Mateus returned to his apartment, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light as he stared at the phone in his hand. The messages were no longer just cryptic notes. They felt like a lifeline, a thread pulling him toward the truth, though he wasn't sure he wanted to follow it. The knock on his door startled him. He hesitated, the glass still in his hand, before setting it down and crossing the room. When he opened the door, Júlia stood there, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd expected. Mateus stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. She moved through the space with an air of familiarity, as if she'd been there before, though he was certain she hadn't. She stopped near the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. "I need you to be honest with me," Mateus said, his tone firmer than he felt. "What's going on? Why are you here?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You don't trust me." "Can you blame me?" he shot back. "First, you show up out of nowhere, and now I'm getting these messages warning me about everyone, including you." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she took a step closer. "I'm here because I know what Eduardo is capable of. You think you're part of his inner circle, but you're just another piece on his board. When the time comes, he won't hesitate to sacrifice you." The words hit Mateus like a blow, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And you? What do you want?" "To survive," she said simply. "Same as you." Her honesty was disarming, and for a moment, Mateus saw something in her that felt genuine. But the walls he'd built around himself wouldn't crumble so easily. "If that's true, then help me. Tell me what you know." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if weighing her options. "Not yet. There's something I need to confirm first." Before he could press her further, she turned and walked out, leaving him with more questions than answers. As the door clicked shut behind her, Mateus felt the threads of his life tightening around him, pulling him deeper into a web of lies and deceit. The city lights outside blurred as he leaned against the window, his reflection a fragmented image in the glass. Somewhere, buried in the chaos, was the truth. And he was starting to realize that finding it might cost him everything. Mateus stood in the center of Eduardo's expansive office, the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the impeccable furnishings and the man who owned it all. Eduardo paced behind his desk, his expression unreadable, the silence between them thick and suffocating. Mateus felt the tension ripple through his chest, every nerve on edge. "Do you know what makes someone indispensable in this world?" Eduardo finally asked, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Loyalty. Not just to me, but to the work, the vision, the outcome." He stopped pacing and turned to Mateus, his piercing gaze locking onto his. "Can I count on you?" Mateus hesitated for a fraction of a second, a hesitation Eduardo caught immediately. "Of course," Mateus replied, forcing conviction into his tone, but even as he said it, doubt churned in his gut. Loyalty, he thought bitterly. To what? A man whose empire was built on secrets and lies. As Eduardo dismissed him, Mateus exited the office with a mask of composure, but inside he was unraveling. The warning messages, Júlia's cryptic revelations, and Eduardo's increasingly erratic behavior were pieces of a puzzle that seemed impossible to complete. That evening, as he walked the bustling streets of the city, his phone buzzed again. The unknown number. The message was brief, yet it chilled him to the core. "Tonight, meet me at 9. I'll explain everything." Attached was an address, a cafe on the outskirts of the city. Mateus hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, but the need for answers outweighed his caution. He arrived at the cafe just before 9. The quiet hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee offering a momentary reprieve from his turmoil. Júlia was already there, seated at a corner table, her back to the wall. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "You came," she said simply. "I need to know what's going on," Mateus replied, sliding into the seat across from her. "No more riddles. No more half-truths." Júlia leaned forward, her voice low. "Eduardo is more than just a businessman. The deals you've been working on, they're fronts for something much bigger, something far more dangerous." Mateus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "What are you talking about?" "Money laundering, tax evasion, political bribes," she listed, her tone flat. "You've been part of it without even realizing it. That's how he operates. He makes you think you're playing by the rules. But the truth is, there are no rules in Eduardo's game." The words hit him like a blow, each one stripping away the illusion of control he'd clung to. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not like him," Júlia said, her voice softening. "I see it in the way you hesitate, the way you question things. You have a chance to walk away before it's too late." Mateus shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Walk away? Do you have any idea what that would cost me? My career, my family. It's all tied to this." Júlia's eyes met his, unwavering. "And what will it cost you if you stay?" The question lingered between them, heavy with implication. Mateus wanted to argue, to dismiss her warnings as paranoia, but deep down he knew she was right. The path he was on led to a dead end, or worse. As they left the cafe, Júlia stopped him at the door. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her tone urgent. "Eduardo doesn't trust you. He's been testing you, waiting for you to slip up." Mateus felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. "How do you know that?" "Because he did the same thing to me," Júlia admitted. "And when I failed his test, he made sure I paid the price." Before he could press her further, she slipped into the night, leaving him alone under the dim glow of the streetlights. Mateus stood there for a long moment, her words echoing in his mind. The foundations of his carefully constructed world were crumbling, and he was running out of time to decide which side he was on. Back in his apartment, Mateus sat in the darkness, the city lights flickering outside his window. The stakes had never been higher, and the choices before him had never been clearer or more perilous. The days that followed Julia's warning were a blur of suspicion and unease. Mateus moved through Eduardo's world like a shadow, hyper-aware of every word, every glance, every subtle shift in tone. Eduardo's calm demeanor now felt like a mask, his smiles like veiled threats. Mateus knew he was being watched by Eduardo, by his associates, and possibly by people he didn't even know existed. One afternoon, Eduardo called Mateus into his office, his tone sharper than usual. "There's a deal tonight. I want you there." The simplicity of the request only heightened Mateus's suspicion. Eduardo's deals were rarely straightforward, and this one felt particularly ominous. "What kind of deal?" Mateus asked, careful to keep his voice neutral. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable. "A test of loyalty," he said finally. The words sent a chill down Mateus's spine. That evening, Mateus found himself in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by men whose expressions ranged from indifferent to hostile. Eduardo arrived last, his presence commanding as always, and gestured for Mateus to join him in a secluded corner. "This is a simple transaction," Eduardo said, his voice low. "You'll handle the details. Think of it as a chance to prove yourself." Mateus nodded, his heart pounding. The briefcase Eduardo handed him felt heavier than it should have, its contents unknown but undoubtedly incriminating. As the transaction began, Mateus forced himself to focus, masking his unease with a façade of confidence. But as the deal progressed, he noticed something, a subtle exchange of glances, a shift in the air, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. The men on the other side of the table were stalling, their questions pointed and probing. Mateus answered as best he could, but his growing unease was impossible to ignore. Then, one of them leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You don't seem like you belong here." The comment was casual, but the accusation beneath it was clear. Mateus hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Eduardo to notice. "Is there a problem?" Eduardo's voice cut through the room, his tone icy. "No problem," Mateus replied quickly, forcing a smile. But the damage was done. Eduardo's eyes lingered on him, cold and calculating, as if weighing his worth. The deal concluded without incident, but the unease in the room lingered long after the men had gone. As Mateus left the warehouse, Eduardo's words echoed in his mind. A test of loyalty. On his way home, Mateus's phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "Be ready. They're watching your every move." The message sent a jolt of fear through him, but it also solidified his resolve. If Eduardo was testing him, then Mateus would test him right back. He needed to uncover the full extent of Eduardo's operations, and fast. The next morning, Mateus met Júlia at a small cafe on the edge of the city, the location chosen for its lack of familiarity. Her expression was tense, her usual composure replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "They're closing in on you," she said, skipping any preamble. "Eduardo's men are already asking questions." "I need more," Mateus replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Details, names, anything that can give me an edge." Júlia hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. "This is all I could gather, but be careful. If Eduardo finds out—" "He won't," Mateus interrupted, though the conviction in his voice was more for himself than for her. Inside the folder were documents, photographs, and lists of transactions that painted a damning picture of Eduardo's empire. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also dangerous. Holding it felt like holding a loaded weapon, one that could just as easily destroy him as it could save him. As he walked away from the cafe, Mateus felt the weight of the folder in his bag and the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The path ahead was clear, but it was fraught with peril. One wrong move and everything, his career, his family, his life, could come crashing down. That night, Mateus sat by his window, the city's glow a distant reminder of the world he once dreamed of conquering. Now it felt like a cage, its bars forged from secrets and lies. The only way out was through, and he was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The air was heavy with anticipation as Mateus sat in his dimly lit apartment, the folder Júlia had given him spread out across the small table. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence pointed to the dark heart of Eduardo's empire. The money, the power, it was all a façade, masking an intricate web of corruption and betrayal. Mateus's mind raced as he tried to connect the dots, the magnitude of what he was uncovering both thrilling and terrifying. But there was one document that stood out, a ledger with a series of coded transactions. At first glance it appeared mundane, but a closer look revealed discrepancies, transfers routed through shell companies, amounts that didn't add up, and most disturbingly, a name Mateus recognized immediately: Clara. His heart sank as he stared at her name, written in Eduardo's unmistakable handwriting. What connection could Clara possibly have to all of this? The thought of her being involved in Eduardo's schemes was unthinkable, yet there it was, staring back at him in black and white. Desperation gripped him. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Mateus grabbed his phone and dialed Júlia's number, his fingers trembling. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Mateus, what is it?" "There's something in the documents," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "A name, Clara. Do you know anything about this?" There was a pause, and when Júlia spoke again, her voice was careful. "I've seen the name before. Eduardo mentioned her once in passing. He seemed nostalgic. I didn't think much of it at the time." Mateus's grip on the phone tightened. "I need to know what he's done to her." "I'll see what I can find," Júlia said, though her tone held a note of hesitation. "But Mateus, if Eduardo finds out what we're doing—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Just find out." The call ended, and Mateus was left with 1,000 unanswered questions. He tried to push them aside, to focus on the task at hand, but the thought of Clara consumed him. The life he had walked away from was now entwined with the world he had fought to belong to, and the collision of those two realities was more than he could bear. The following day, Eduardo called Mateus into his office. The atmosphere was tense, and Mateus could feel the weight of Eduardo's gaze as he entered the room. Eduardo's usual charm was absent, replaced by an intensity that set Mateus on edge. "There's a problem," Eduardo began, his voice calm but laced with menace. "One of our contacts has been asking questions, uncomfortable questions." Mateus forced himself to stay calm. "Do you know who it is?" Eduardo leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I have my suspicions, but what I need from you is loyalty. If there's someone in our midst who's been compromised, I trust you'll help me root them out." The words hung in the air, their implication clear. Eduardo didn't trust him. The test of loyalty wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, Mateus met Júlia in a secluded park, the darkness shielding them from prying eyes. She handed him a small envelope, her expression grim. "This is all I could find," she said, "but you're not going to like it." Mateus opened the envelope, his hands shaking. Inside was a photograph of Clara, taken outside one of Eduardo's properties. The sight of her face, familiar yet distant, sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. She looked different, older, more weary, but there was no mistaking her. "She's been working for Eduardo," Júlia explained, her voice heavy with regret. "Not directly, but through one of his subsidiaries. It looks like she got involved after you left." I don't know if she knows the full extent of what he does." Mateus's mind reeled as he tried to process the information. Clara, the woman he had left behind to protect, was now caught in the very web he had tried to escape. The irony was cruel, and the guilt was suffocating. As Mateus walked away from Júlia, the photograph clutched in his hand. He felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like never before. The path he was on was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. He had to confront Eduardo, to expose the truth, not just for himself, but for Clara and everyone else who had been ensnared in Eduardo's world. But as he stared out at the city lights, he knew that the cost of the truth would be steep, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to pay it. The world around Mateus felt like it was crumbling, every piece of his life teetering on the edge of collapse. The photograph of Clara, now creased from his anxious grip, lay on the table in his apartment. Her face haunted him, a painful reminder of everything he had tried to escape. Clara was more than a memory now. She was the thread tying him to Eduardo's tangled web of corruption. He spent hours poring over the evidence Júlia had provided, each page uncovering another layer of Eduardo's deception. The transactions were clearer now, pointing to shell companies and offshore accounts that funneled vast sums of money. Clara's name appeared again and again, linked to a subsidiary Mateus hadn't recognized before. The realization hit him like a blow. Clara was unwittingly complicit in Eduardo's crimes. Mateus knew there was no avoiding the confrontation. He had to see Clara, to understand how deeply she was involved, but more than that, he needed to warn her about the danger she was in. That night, he found himself outside a modest office building in the city's industrial district. The lights inside were still on, a lone silhouette visible through the frosted glass. He waited, his heart pounding, until the silhouette moved toward the door. When Clara stepped outside, her face lit briefly by the flickering street lamp, Mateus felt a wave of emotion crash over him. She looked tired, her shoulders hunched under the weight of something invisible. But she was still Clara, the woman he had loved and left behind. "Clara," he called softly, stepping out of the shadows. She turned, her eyes widening in shock. "Mateus?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and something sharper, anger perhaps, or hurt. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice urgent. "It's important." She hesitated, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. "After all this time, what could you possibly have to say to me?" "It's about Eduardo," Mateus replied, his tone pleading, "and your work with him." Her expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong. I'm not accusing you of anything," Mateus said quickly, "but you're involved in something you don't understand. Eduardo isn't who you think he is." Clara's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Mateus thought she might walk away. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine, 5 minutes." They sat on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp, the hum of the city around them a faint backdrop. Mateus explained everything, the documents, the transactions, the warnings. Clara listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she shook her head. "I knew the company wasn't perfect," she said finally, "but I never imagined—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her jaw tightening. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," Mateus said. "And because Eduardo is watching both of us. If we don't do something, he'll destroy us." Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment the anger in her gaze softened into something more vulnerable. "You think we can stop him?" "We have to," Mateus replied. "For your sake, for mine, for everyone he's hurt." The next morning, Mateus and Clara met Júlia in a quiet cafe, the atmosphere tense with unspoken fears. Júlia laid out a plan, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. They would leak the documents to an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. The risk was enormous, but it was their only chance to bring Eduardo down. As they finalized the details, Mateus noticed Clara glancing around nervously. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I think we're being followed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mateus's heart sank. The cafe suddenly felt claustrophobic, the shadows at the edges of the room darker and more threatening. He scanned the faces around them, searching for anything out of place. "We need to move," Júlia said, her tone urgent. "Now!" They left the cafe in silence, their movements deliberate and cautious. Mateus stayed close to Clara, his eyes darting to every alley and doorway. The city, once a place of opportunity, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. As they turned a corner, a black car idling near the curb roared to life. Mateus's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her into a nearby alley. Júlia followed, her breath ragged. The car sped past, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. "That was too close," Júlia muttered, leaning against the wall. Mateus nodded, his mind racing. Eduardo's reach was longer than he had imagined, and their window of opportunity was shrinking. They had to act quickly, or the truth they were trying to expose would die with them. The city skyline loomed against a darkening sky as Mateus, Clara, and Júlia sat in a cramped room that smelled faintly of old coffee and printer ink. The investigative journalist, a sharp-eyed man named Victor, was sifting through the documents they had brought. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and grim determination. "This is enough to bring Eduardo down," Victor said, his voice steady. "But it's going to make waves. Big ones. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Mateus glanced at Clara, her face pale but resolute, then at Júlia, whose eyes were fixed on Victor. "We're ready," he said firmly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Victor nodded, gathering the files into a neat stack. "Once this goes public, there's no turning back. He'll come after all of you." "We know," Clara said, her voice quieter but no less certain. "But he has to be stopped." The decision was made, and Victor left to begin the process of publishing the story. For the first time in weeks, the three of them sat in silence, the enormity of their actions sinking in. Eduardo's empire, his carefully constructed façade of wealth and respectability, was about to crumble. The next morning, Mateus awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. He grabbed it, blinking against the harsh light of the screen. The headline was everywhere: "Billionaire Eduardo Duarte exposed in massive financial scandal." The article detailed everything: the shell companies, the bribes, the laundering. It was a bombshell, and the fallout was immediate. Mateus spent the day glued to the news, watching as Eduardo's name was dragged through the mud. There were protests outside his corporate headquarters, demands for investigations, and endless speculation about who had leaked the information. But beneath the surface of triumph, a gnawing fear lingered. Eduardo wouldn't go down quietly. That fear became reality that evening when a car pulled up outside Mateus's apartment. He spotted it through the window, its presence deliberate and menacing. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You think this is over?" Mateus's heart pounded as he grabbed his coat and headed for the fire escape. He couldn't risk staying. He called Clara and Júlia, warning them to leave their homes immediately. The three of them regrouped at a safe house Victor had arranged, a nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city. Inside, the air was tense, every sound outside making them flinch. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Júlia replied, though her expression betrayed her unease. The wait didn't last long. The next day, news broke that Eduardo had been arrested, charged with multiple counts of fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. The image of him being escorted out of his office in handcuffs was surreal. For Mateus, it was a moment of vindication, but also of reflection. The man who had once been his mentor, who had promised him the world, was now a symbol of everything Mateus had come to despise. As the dust began to settle, Mateus found himself back at the small cafe where he and Clara had first reconnected. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her expression pensive. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Mateus shook his head. "Not yet, but it's a start." Clara smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in days. "You did the right thing, Mateus, even if it wasn't easy." Her words struck a chord, and for a moment, the weight of everything he had endured lifted. The choices he had made, the sacrifices, the risks, they had all led to this, a chance to start over. Looking back on it all, Mateus realized something. It wasn't the money, the power, or even the redemption that mattered most. It was the people he had fought to protect, the people who had stood by him when the world seemed ready to swallow him whole. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Mateus's shoes? I'd love to hear your perspective, and if you're looking for more stories of resilience and redemption, make sure to like and subscribe. There's more to come. Mateus stood as Clara reached for her coat, the two of them stepping out into the crisp evening air. The city buzzed around them, alive with possibility. For the first time in a long time, Mateus felt free, not from the burden of his past, but from the fear that it defined him. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape.